A Queen in a Cage. The Great Hall of Westminster glitters with gold and torchlight. Banners hang from the rafters like captured storms. Nobles in velvet whisper behind jeweled goblets. Musicians play softly near the walls, while servants move through the crowd carrying trays heavy with wine and roasted meat. It looks like power, but power in this room is strangely misplaced. At the center of the hall sits a young queen with the posture of someone who has been taught all her life how to rule. Her gown is French silk, her crown small and delicate against dark hair, her expression composed in the careful way royal daughters learn before they can even read. This is Isabella of France. She was born the daughter of one of Europe's most formidable kings, raised in the disciplined court of Philip IV of France, where politics moved with the precision of chess pieces and weakness rarely survived long. At 12 years old, she crossed the cold waters of the Channel to marry the young King of England. The marriage was supposed to unite two powerful kingdoms. It was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it placed Isabella inside a court that already felt like a battlefield. Across the hall, laughter erupts near the king's table. England's ruler, Edward II, sits surrounded not by generals or statesmen, but by his favorite companions, men whose influence at court has already begun to anger powerful nobles across the kingdom. The loudest voice among them belongs to one man in particular, Piers Gaveston. He jokes with the king as if the throne itself was simply another chair at the table. The nobles watching from the edges of the hall do not laugh. Their eyes move between the king and his favorite, and then, quietly, toward the queen. Because everyone in this room understands something Isabella is only beginning to realize. England is becoming dangerously unstable. The king trusts the wrong men. The nobles are losing patience. And the young queen, beautiful, intelligent, and very far from home, has just stepped into the middle of a storm that will eventually bring down a crown. One day, history will give Isabella a nickname. Not princess, not queen, but something far more dangerous, the she-wolf of France. Across the Channel, England's young king needed an alliance with France. The solution was simple, a marriage. At 12 years old, Isabella of France left the disciplined court of Philip IV of France and sailed toward a kingdom she had never seen. The voyage across the grey waters of the Channel must have felt enormous to a girl that young. France disappeared behind her like a fading memory, while the English coast rose slowly out of the mist. Waiting there was her husband, the new King of England, Edward II. At first glance, Edward seemed promising. He was handsome, energetic, and capable of great charm when he chose to use it. The court celebrated the royal wedding with the kind of spectacle medieval monarchies excelled at: feasts, tournaments, and endless ceremony meant to show the strength of the alliance between two powerful kingdoms. But beneath the glitter, something strange was already happening. The king's attention rarely stayed on his young queen for long. Instead, it drifted constantly toward one man, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston had been Edward's companion long before Isabella arrived. Their friendship, intense, exclusive, and politically dangerous, was already causing tension among England's nobles. The king showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and influence that many powerful lords believed should never have belonged to a royal favorite. To the English aristocracy, Gaveston represented everything they feared: a man with too much access to the king, too much influence over royal decisions, and far too little respect for the traditions that kept noble families secure. At court, the resentment grew quickly. The barons whispered among themselves, while Gaveston openly mocked them. Rivalries hardened into open hostility. The royal council fractured into factions that spent as much time fighting each other as they did governing the kingdom. And in the middle of it all stood Isabella, still barely a teenager, watching the court she had married into slowly tear itself apart. The humiliation was public. At banquets, Gaveston sometimes behaved as if he were the true companion of the king, while the queen sat quietly to the side. Nobles noticed it, diplomats noticed it, and Isabella herself could hardly fail to see the imbalance forming around her. But she also understood something the English barons did not. She had been raised in the court of Philip IV. She knew that power rarely shifts in sudden explosions. More often, it moves quietly, waiting for the moment when the people who hold it make one mistake too many. And in England, that moment was getting closer every year. At first, it seemed as though the storm had passed. The anger of the English nobles had finally reached its breaking point. Their patience with Piers Gaveston, the king's arrogant favourite, collapsed into open rebellion. Barons gathered armies, pressure mounted, and eventually Gaveston was captured and executed. For a moment the kingdom exhaled. Many believed the worst was over. Without Gaveston, surely Edward II would return to more traditional rule. The nobles expected the king to rebuild trust with the powerful families who had supported the crown for generations. For Isabella of France, the change even seemed promising. The young queen had endured years of humiliation, while Gaveston dominated the king's attention. With the favourite gone, there was hope that the balance of power at court might finally stabilise. But power abhors a vacuum, and in England's royal court, another pair of ambitious men were already stepping forward to fill it. They were father and son, the Despensers. The younger of the two, Hugh Despenser the younger, quickly gained Edward's confidence. Where Gaveston had been flamboyant and openly provocative, the Despensers operated with colder calculation. They built their influence piece by piece, attaching themselves to royal authority while quietly expanding their own wealth and territory. Soon their power at court began to rival anything Gaveston had once possessed. Lands were seized, rivals were pushed aside. Political enemies found themselves suddenly facing royal punishment. And once again, England's great barons watched with growing fury as the king allowed a small inner circle to dominate the kingdom. For Isabella, the change was even more dangerous. Under the Despensers' influence, the queen's position began to shrink rather than grow. Her allies were removed from court, her revenues were restricted. The respect that should have surrounded the Queen of England began quietly disappearing. It was no longer simply humiliation, it was isolation. The Despensers understood something important about power. If Isabella remained influential, she could become a rallying point for the king's enemies. So they worked carefully to push her out of the centre of the court, step by step, privilege by privilege, until the daughter of the King of France found herself standing inside the English court with fewer allies every year. But Isabella had learned patience long before she ever arrived in England. She had watched the politics of her father's court. She understood that powerful men often believed their control was permanent right before it began to crumble. And the Despensers were making one critical mistake. They believed the Queen had nowhere else to turn. They were wrong. By the early 1320s, England no longer felt like a stable kingdom. It felt like a pressure vessel. The influence of the Despensers tightened around the crown like iron bands. Under the guidance of Hugh Despenser the younger, the court became a place where enemies vanished quickly, and allies were rewarded with lands taken from rivals. For the powerful nobles of England, the situation had become unbearable. Many of them had already rebelled once during the chaos surrounding Piers Gaveston. Now they watched the same pattern unfolding again, royal favour flowing toward a small circle of men while the traditional balance of power collapsed. Rebellion returned. Barons gathered forces and marched against the crown, hoping to force Edward II to abandon the Despensers and restore the old order. This time, the king struck back harder. The rebellion was crushed, lands were confiscated, former allies were executed or exiled. The Despensers tightened their control even further, determined that no second uprising would threaten their influence. And in the middle of this tightening circle stood Isabella of France. Her position had become almost impossible. She was the Queen of England, but her voice carried little weight in the king's court. Her husband trusted the Despensers far more than he trusted his own wife. The nobles who might once have rallied behind her were either defeated, imprisoned, or scattered across exile. Even her connection to France became a source of suspicion. The Despensers feared that Isabella's family, especially her powerful brother, the new King of France, might intervene in English affairs. Instead of strengthening her influence, her royal birth became another reason to isolate her. Her income was restricted, her household was reduced, her movements were watched. For a woman raised in one of Europe's most disciplined courts, the message was painfully clear. She was no longer simply being ignored, she was being contained. But politics rarely move in straight lines. In 1325, a diplomatic crisis between England and France forced Edward II to send representatives across the Channel to negotiate peace with the French crown. At first, the mission seemed routine, a matter of territory, a matter of royal obligation. But when the king decided that the person who should travel to France was his own queen, the dispensers made a mistake they would not understand until it was far too late. Because sending Isabella back to her homeland did something they had worked very hard to prevent. It gave the queen distance. And distance in politics can be the most dangerous thing of all. In 1325, the English court faced a problem that could not be solved with intimidation or royal punishment. The dispute lay across the Channel. For years, tensions had simmered between England and France over the Duchy of Gascony, English territory that technically remained under the authority of the French crown. When negotiations finally became unavoidable, Edward II made a decision that seemed sensible at the time. He would send his queen. No one could represent English interests in France more diplomatically than Isabella of France, the daughter of Philip IV of France and sister to the reigning French king. To the dispensers, it seemed safe enough. Isabella had been politically isolated for years. She had few allies left in England and little visible power. Sending her to France solved several problems at once. It allowed negotiations to proceed, and it removed a potentially troublesome queen from the English court. What they did not understand was that Isabella had been waiting. France was not simply another court. It was home. The moment Isabella stepped back onto French soil, something shifted. The careful restrictions placed around her in England disappeared almost overnight. The daughter of the Capetian dynasty was no longer a quiet, controlled figure in someone else's kingdom. She was a princess again, and people listened. At first, the mission followed its official purpose. Negotiations moved forward, and arrangements were made for England to maintain its territories under the authority of the French crown. As part of the settlement, Isabella's young son, Edward III, was sent to France to perform the formal act of homage on behalf of his father. That decision changed everything. Once the prince arrived, Isabella had something the dispensers had never intended to give her: the heir to the English throne. Suddenly, the queen who had spent years isolated at court possessed something far more powerful than titles or ceremony. She had legitimacy. Around her gathered the men who had fled England during the dispensers' rise. Exiled nobles, angry lords, and political survivors who had watched their lands and influence vanish under Edward's rule now found themselves standing in the same place, under the same banner. Among them was one man who would become central to everything that followed: Roger Mortimer. Mortimer had once been one of the most powerful barons in England before falling victim to the dispensers' revenge. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, he had escaped dramatically and fled to France, where he waited for the opportunity to return. When Isabella and Mortimer met, their alliance formed quickly. Both had reasons to hate the dispensers. Both had reasons to challenge Edward's authority. And together, they possessed something that had been missing from every previous rebellion against the king: leadership. Soon rumors began moving quietly across Europe. The Queen of England had refused to return to her husband. She had gathered allies. By the summer of 1326, the rumors had hardened into something very real. Along the northern coast of France, ships gathered quietly. Soldiers arrived in small groups, careful not to draw too much attention. Exiled English nobles found their way to the Queen's camp, bringing whatever men and resources they could muster. It was not a massive army, but it didn't need to be, because the rebellion that Isabella of France was preparing relied on something far more powerful than numbers. It relied on the fact that many people in England already hated the men controlling the king. The Despensers had spent years building enemies, confiscating lands, punishing rivals, humiliating powerful families. And now, those families were waiting for a chance to strike back. In September of 1326, the moment arrived. Isabella and Roger Mortimer sailed for England with a small but determined force. With them came the young prince, Edward III, whose presence made the rebellion far easier to justify. This was not simply a revolt against the king, it was a mission to rescue the kingdom from the influence of the Despensers. Or at least, that was the story. When the fleet landed on the English coast, something remarkable happened. The kingdom began to collapse around the king. City after city opened its gates to Isabella's forces. Nobles, who had once remained silent, now declared their support for the queen and her son. Even men who had served Edward for years began abandoning him as the balance of power shifted. The Despensers, who had ruled England through fear and royal favour, suddenly discovered how fragile their position truly was. The elder Despenser was captured first. Dragged before a furious crowd, he was executed with brutal efficiency. His death, a public signal that the old order was crumbling. His son, Hugh Despenser the Younger, fled with the king as Isabella's supporters advanced across the country. But there was nowhere left to run. Within months of landing in England, the Queen's rebellion had achieved something almost unthinkable. The kingdom no longer belonged to the king. It belonged to the woman who had once been pushed aside in his court. And the final act of the drama, the fall of Edward II, was now only a matter of time. The king ran. It was not the sort of scene medieval chronicles liked to celebrate. Kings were supposed to lead armies, stand firm behind castle walls, or die dramatically on the battlefield. But as the rebellion spread across England in 1326, Edward II discovered that the kingdom he believed he controlled had quietly slipped out of his hands. Cities opened their gates to the invading force led by Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer. Powerful nobles declared their loyalty to the Queen and her young son instead of the crown. Even royal officials who had once served Edward faithfully began abandoning him as the tide turned. The king fled westward, hoping to reach Wales, where loyal supporters might still gather. But the Despensers, whose influence had once made them untouchable, were now hunted men. The elder Despenser had already been captured and executed. His son, Hugh Despenser the Younger, remained beside the king as they moved desperately from one stronghold to another. Their escape did not last long. Edward and Despenser were eventually captured by forces loyal to Isabella. The once powerful royal favourite was dragged before the rebels and executed with a brutality meant to satisfy years of anger and humiliation. With the Despensers gone, the rebellion reached its true target, the king himself. Edward was imprisoned, first in one castle, then another, while Isabella and Mortimer consolidated their control over the government. The nobles who had rallied behind the Queen now faced a decision that had almost no precedent in English history. A king still sat on the throne, but the kingdom no longer recognized his authority. In January of 1327, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Edward II was forced to abdicate. The crown passed to his 14-year-old son, Edward III, who was officially proclaimed King of England. In theory, the young monarch now ruled the realm. In reality, everyone understood who had made it possible. For the first time in England's history, a reigning king had been removed from power through organized rebellion, and at the center of it all stood the woman who had once been treated as little more than decoration in the royal court. The Queen of England, the daughter of France, the woman the chroniclers were beginning to call something both admiring and dangerous, the she-wolf. England now had a new king, but the boy who wore the crown was only 14, which meant the real power in the kingdom rested somewhere else. For the next several years, England was ruled not by Edward III, but by the two people who had made his reign possible: his mother, Isabella of France, and her closest ally, Roger Mortimer. At first, many nobles welcomed the new government. The Despensers were gone, The chaos of the previous reign seemed to be ending. The Queen who had overthrown a king appeared ready to restore stability to England. But power gained through rebellion has a way of reshaping the people who hold it. Mortimer quickly became the most powerful man in the kingdom. Lands, titles, and influence flowed toward him in much the same way they had once flowed toward the king's former favorites. His authority grew so large that some nobles began whispering that the new government looked suspiciously like the old one. Only this time, the favorite standing beside the throne was Mortimer himself, and beside him stood Isabella. The rumors began quietly. Some questioned the closeness of their alliance. Others wondered whether Mortimer had become something more than a political partner to the Queen. Medieval chroniclers, never particularly gentle with powerful women, began spreading stories that painted Isabella as ambitious, manipulative, even dangerous. It was during these years that her most famous nickname began appearing in whispers and writings: the She-Wolf of France. To her supporters, the title sounded almost heroic. She had crossed the sea, rallied a rebellion, and toppled a failing king. To her enemies, the name carried a darker meaning. A wolf did not simply rule, a wolf hunted. Meanwhile, the young king watched. Edward III grew older in a court where his mother and Mortimer made the decisions. He attended councils, observed negotiations, and quietly studied the balance of power around him. He had inherited a crown at 14, but the kingdom still belonged to someone else. And as the years passed, the boy who had once needed his mother's rebellion to become king began reaching an expensive conclusion. If he wanted to rule England himself, he would have to take power the same way Isabella had taken it from his father. Power rarely sits still for long. For several years after the fall of Edward II, England existed in a strange balance. The young king, Edward III, sat on the throne, but the real authority of the kingdom remained in the hands of his mother, Isabella of France, and her powerful ally, Roger Mortimer. Mortimer had risen quickly, too quickly. Titles accumulated around him, lands were granted to him and his allies. Royal decisions seemed to pass through his hands before reaching the king himself. Some nobles began muttering that England had simply traded one royal favourite for another. But the most dangerous observer of Mortimer's growing influence was not a rebellious baron or a jealous noble. It was the king. Edward III had spent his teenage years watching carefully. He had seen how his father lost control of the kingdom by trusting the wrong men. He had seen how rebellion could sweep through a country when powerful families felt ignored or humiliated. And he had seen Mortimer standing beside the throne as if the kingdom belonged to him. By 1330, Edward was 17 years old enough to understand the danger, old enough to act. The moment came in the autumn of that year inside Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer and Isabella were staying with the royal court. The fortress seemed secure, its gates guarded, and its walls strong. But Edward had already begun gathering allies of his own. One night, under cover of darkness, the young king and a small group of trusted companions slipped into the castle through a secret passage known only to a few guards. They moved quietly through the stone corridors until they reached the chambers where Mortimer was staying. The confrontation was swift. Mortimer was arrested before he could fully understand what was happening. Despite Isabella's protests, according to some accounts, she cried out for mercy for her ally. The king refused to be persuaded. Mortimer was taken into custody and soon afterward executed for treason. Just like that, the balance of power changed again. The man who had helped overthrow one king had fallen to the authority of another. And for the first time since childhood, Edward III ruled England in his own right. But the question remained: what would become of the woman who had made his crown possible? The queen who had once led an invasion against his father, the woman history already knew as the She-Wolf of France. When Roger Mortimer was dragged from Nottingham Castle and later executed, many in England expected the same fate to fall upon the woman who had helped raise him to power. After all, it had been Isabella of France who led the invasion. It had been Isabella who had gathered the rebels. It had been Isabella who forced the abdication of Edward II and placed the crown upon the head of her young son. In another kingdom, another age, a ruler might have chosen revenge. But Edward III did something far more complicated. He spared her. Isabella was removed from political power. Her influence at court quietly dissolved. The queen who had once directed the fate of a kingdom stepped away from the machinery of rule and into a quieter life, living comfortably on estates granted by her son. She was no longer the centre of England's politics, but she was never treated as a prisoner. In fact, the relationship between mother and son appears to have softened with time. Isabella lived long enough to watch Edward III grow into one of the most formidable medieval kings England would ever produce. She saw him strengthen the monarchy. She saw him lead armies, and she saw him build a reign that would eventually ignite the long conflict later known as the 100 Years' War. The woman who had once been called the she-wolf of France did not die in disgrace. She died in 1358, wealthy, respected in her own strange way, and still surrounded by the symbols of royalty. History never quite decided what to make of her. Some chroniclers painted her as a dangerous woman who betrayed her husband and helped destroy a king. Others saw something more complex, a political survivor who stepped into a collapsing court and forced change where no one else could. What cannot be denied is this: Isabella of France altered the course of English history. She proved that a queen dismissed as powerless could gather allies, cross a sea, topple a king, and reshape a kingdom. And she did it in a world that rarely allowed women to hold power openly. History remembers kings for their battles, but sometimes the most dangerous figure in the room is the person everyone underestimated. If you felt the tension in the halls of Westminster and the quiet fury behind Isabella's crown, don't let her story disappear into the dust of medieval chronicles. History is full of women who refused to stay where the world placed them, women who learned how power truly works and used it when the moment came. Subscribe as we continue uncovering the lives of the dark heroines. Next time, we stay in England, but the crown is about to become far more dangerous. The country will tear itself apart in a brutal civil war known as the Wars of the Roses, where rival families fight for the throne and loyalty changes with every battle. In the middle of that chaos rises a queen who refuses to watch her husband's crown collapse. She gathers armies, she rides with soldiers, and she fights like a general in a war that will decide the fate of the English monarchy. Next time, Margaret of Anjou, the War Queen of England. Stay dangerous, stay loud, and never let them hold the pen.